Professor Niall Ferguson's with me, Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and author of the book Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. You were talking just last week about the Cold War too, and we're clearly in it. And it is different, you say, because of the relationship with China and vis-a-vis Russia. But how dangerous is the position we're now in?
Well, Richard, if you think of it this way, there was an interwar period between World War I and World War II, and there was an interwar period between Cold War I and Cold War II. From 1991 until, well, just about now, most people assumed that the Cold War was over and that the end of history had arrived and we were all going to live more or less happily ever after, give or take the odd jihadist terrorist attack. We've been reminded forcibly, not just by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but by other events too, that in fact Cold War can be back. And this time, the difference is that China's the senior partner on the other side and Russia's the junior partner, whereas at the beginning of Cold War I, China was clearly the junior partner and Russia or the Soviet Union the senior partner. So that's how I would think about the world we find ourselves in today.
Right, but what's the significance of that shifting of roles between China and Russia, bearing in mind that it's Russia that's doing the fighting at the moment in Europe, China seemingly, for the moment, on the sidelines, watching and waiting?
Well, Richard, if you think back to the beginning of the First Cold War, the hot war that really kicked things off was in Korea, and China did the fighting there. Against the United States and other allies that intervened on the side of South Korea. This time around, Russia's doing the fighting and China's watching a bit nervously, I would think. Xi Jinping clearly gave a green light to Vladimir Putin prior to the invasion of Ukraine and said, you've got to wait till my Olympics are over and then you go do what you want to do. But I think he assumed that this, as indeed most people did, that this would be relatively easy for Russia and a relatively short war. Now the Chinese find themselves backing a potential loser, they also find themselves being told by the United States, you better not break our sanctions and start supplying military material to the Russians or we're going to sanction you. And so China has in some ways backed away from full-blown support for Russia. In fact, its exports to Russia are down quite significantly since the war began, suggesting that the Chinese are listening to the threat that was made by the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan.
The President Putin's economy, the Russian economy is being decimated literally by the sanctions, and it will get worse. But if I take a look at today's markets and I look at the problems of the Fed and I look at all the economic problems that have been exacerbated, they weren't created, but they've certainly been made much worse by the war in Ukraine, inflation, etc. To some extent, Putin is able to inflict huge economic damage on us at a time when we least need it.
That's right, Richard. There was already a pretty serious inflation problem in the US starting last year through errors of fiscal and monetary policy. But the outbreak of war has made the inflation problem significantly worse. And it's also made it global because of the importance of Russian and Ukrainian wheat exports to so many developing countries. I think we oversold sanctions, at least the United States government did, by suggesting first that they might deter Putin and then that they might cripple his war effort. They're actually more slow acting than that. The ruble has not collapsed. The Russian economy has not even been decimated. The IMF thinks it's going to contract about 8% this year. But there's a slow burn effect that means Putin can't really survive a long war. And that's because Russia's industry depends on imported microprocessors and other high-end stuff. And basically, without those, they can't make 21st century weaponry. They're already pretty much running out of sophisticated weapons, which means they're now fighting essentially with 20th century technology against a Ukrainian army that has been supplied on a massive scale by the United States and its allies with 21st century weaponry. That's a big problem for Putin.
Niall, finally, what worries you most about the current situation? Is it the prospect of the US being dragged in further? Is it some form of, God forbid, nuclear adventurism by Putin. If you look at the way this is likely to progress, what is most concerning to you?
Richard, what most worries me is that the US strategy seems to be to keep this war going, bleed Russia dry, hope for regime change in Russia, and hope that that sends a message to China, don't mess with the West, keep your hands off Taiwan. But it's super risky. We're putting Putin into a position where he could lose this war. His army could actually unravel. We're getting reports of indiscipline and orders not being obeyed. Does he just go on TV in Russia and say, I'm a very naughty boy, I resign, and Mr. Navalny can be president? I don't think so. He has the biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, and there is a non-trivial probability that if he is right up against the wall staring defeat in the face, he resorts to using a tactical nuclear weapon in perhaps Western Ukraine. It's not clear to me how we would react to that, but it seems to me that that's an option that we are underestimating, and it would transform the world in a really quite terrifying way if it happened.
You know, I cannot, but I have to just say this, besides thanking you for joining us, I cannot believe we're discussing this, having to discuss this in such a way. It's extraordinary, considering what you and I would have been talking about last year or whatever. Absolutely extraordinary. Niall Ferguson, good to see you, sir. Grateful that you've given us time to